Where I'll be going with this. Just some background, then some discussion on the installation itself, then some theoretical considerations through the perspective of collisions is how we've kind of arranged it. And I'll discuss that in greater detail a little bit later on. And then, obviously, a conclusion. So the Bemba Online project is kind of Debra's baby. This is something that she kind of created. And it's a digital Bemba language archive. Bemba is one of the many languages that they speak in Zambia. As a part of the project, she digitized the Zambia radio program. I call it Kabusha because my Bemba is absolutely terrible, so forgive me for not trying to say it in full. But the name itself comes from a proverb which means the person who inquires first is not poisoned by a mushroom. And really what that means is if you ask questions, you can never go wrong. So that's really what the radio program is, the spirit of it. And what happens in the program is listeners every week would write in a letter to the host. The co-host would read it on the air, and then the host himself, the host being David Yumba, he would answer those questions. And so this program ran for 25 years up until 1990 when he died. And the archive itself from recordings that Debra collected in Zambia between 1986 and 1990, and just kind of some website information of where you can actually find those things. And I have that on the last page as well. So a little bit about David Yumba. As I said, he created, produced, and hosted the program, and it was a writing letter program with a certain amount of religious flavor to it, a certain amount of advice column to it, a certain amount of I'm your big uncle who's going to give you kind of like guide you on the right path kind of situation to it. So it was kind of at the same time political and funny and biting, but always with this kind of advisory tone to it. Sometimes a little bit playful as well. And as it said here, Imelda Yumbe was the co-host, and she plays an important role because she would actually read the letters, and then there would be a little banter back and forth when they were kind of creating the answers. So the remix itself, what it was is, as I said, there was a question and answer session. What I then did was invite people in present day to write letters to the program. So those people would be members of the archives themselves, associated academics, and as the installation kind of moved from place to place, it would include people from the audience, listeners and viewers of the installation itself to writing letters to the program. Once you write a letter into the program, Yumba would answer those questions. And the way he would answer it is that I took all of the digitized archive material and just chopped it up into crazy pieces and then reconstituted it into actual answers to each question. So the installation itself then is, as it says here, a re-engineered and remixed radio program. So what happens is we got a new co-host, Christine Mukuka, who's based in London. She would read the new letters. I would take her recordings, take the recordings from Yumba, chop it up all together, have Yumba answer those questions, and then add in the songs, the ads, the announcements, everything that would make it the radio program once again. Put that back onto an audio cassette tape, and then that would be, once you go into the installation, you would then be listening to the radio program in this new context. Hence, we call it a radio remix. And she read the letters in English because the letters were written in English, but as the installation kind of moves, we've had letters in different languages, and as we incorporate those letters, it would make sense for those letters to then be read in those languages, and then have Yumba respond to them in Bemba. And then we have a transcript of everything so that people can actually understand what's going on. So the full title is called Kabusha Radio Remix, Your Questions Answered by Pioneering Zambian Talk Show Host David Yumba, 1923 to 1990. So nice little short, snappy title we came up with. The exhibit itself has about 30 items. And as I said, it's a 45-minute continuous audio loop. So put a tape in, get one of those tape decks that, for the younger people who use tape decks, they would actually just kind of, you could get it to just slip over to the next side and just keeps going and going and going. So whenever you are part of the installation, you just happen to put it on and you'll catch whatever's happening at that moment. Thus far, we've been in 2 spaces, in Washington, D.C. and in Paris. And just to give you an idea of what the kind of design is, we wrote up a very kind of detailed installation design. So the left side was kind of Yumba's workspace, the center was where the kind of remix was, the right side was kind of like the listener's context. And what was kind of important for the installation was that it did draw very heavily on nostalgia. So we had a calendar from 1989. Everything kind of looked old and kind of like, well, 1989, I was, you know, it wasn't that long ago, but it kind of, you know, it had that kind of more analog vibe to it rather than kind of, you know, iPods and such. So to give you like a actual visual of what it looks like, this is the DC setting. So as you can see, this is kind of the listener's workspace with like a family kind of portrait here, your own letters and writing materials that you'd actually write the letter. This is the transcript right here. This is the tape deck that we had at this space. And then we can see David Yumba over here and the letters that would actually come into him. And then we also had like a coffee cup, a drink cup, just to kind of like give it that I'm at home listening to the radio kind of vibe to it. And this is the Paris space. So you can see the tape deck has changed a little bit and different kind of writing material. So as the installation moves, it kind of like takes on a different flavor in each space, but it's still always drawn from that kind of nostalgic vibe that we thought was important. And here's just a image of one of the listeners kind of like interacting with the installation. Yeah, so as I said, we made sure that it was on an audio cassette, where it was important to kind of harken back to that kind of like analog past of the archive. 45-minute continuous loop. And the actual audio itself includes the letters, the responses, the songs, radio crackle added into it, because obviously the newer recordings that were made for the newer letters were recorded in present day, you know, higher fidelity. So in order to have it match the older sound, we kind of roughed it up a little bit. And then my idea was that if the tape is continued to play and play and play, over time the sound is going to degrade, and then that would just be something I would live with, because that would be the true to the actual, how should I say, it would mimic the reality of the technology that's kind of present. If the tape broke, which hasn't happened yet, then I think we'd have a backup, and then we'd slip in the backup rather than just say, well, the tape broke and that's how, you know, how things go. And then, so the statement that we present on the website is this one here. As the archive voice of the late sage David Yumba is activated to advise a new group of question askers, the installation throws issues of subject agency, immortality, translation, wisdom, ownership, truth, and the media democracy relationship into bold relief. Maybe the questions and answers are for you too. Remember, the one who asks questions never goes wrong. So that was kind of the statement that we had up to invite people to interact. So this is actually what it looks like inside of Audition. Maybe a little bit tough to see. So at the top here is just all background noise. So I had background noise kind of like extended through the entire 48 minutes of the tape. You know, theme song, different aspects. You can see all the kind of like very fine cuts of how different words had to kind of be combined together and actually to have the responses make sense. And then you can see intro song, letter, letter, add, letter, letter song. It's really kind of like put together like a radio program again. And then also, as you heard at the beginning, there's a introduction into the program as if you had actually recorded it straight from the radio. You'd, you know, record a little bit earlier so you get the entire program, and then there's a little bit of the program that's afterwards to kind of like give that same kind of authentic vibe to the remix. So now I'll play you maybe a couple of minutes from the remix itself, and this is one of the letters. This is what the actual transcript looks like. You can see that it's annotated with different parts of information, so you can see exactly where from the archive each letter has been taken from, and various forms of other information that will be important to understanding what's being said. So yeah, I'll play the two parts of this.
Our first letter today is from the Bemba archive team, writing from Atlanta, Georgia, in the USA.
Program E, but newspaper times daily news and so forth.
They'll write in Bemba, Kulibamba Nabambe. An archive is an institutional record. It is also a way to preserve and transfer material. We are dedicated to this work, but we are worried. If we are spending all our time to build up an archive of Bemba language materials, what's to prevent people from judging us as tribalists? Will the project backfire? There are dozens of languages in Zambia. How do you create unity, one Zambia, one nation, when you choose to support one language over all the others? Thank you for your wisdom on these matters. Thank you.
Okay, so that's kind of like a vibe of what the tape is. So Debra wanted to give a statement about why we kind of do this kind of work. And she says that sentient beings live in multisensorial fields of experience, expression, and practice. Lived experience and environments are textured with sound, smell, visual qualities, physical features, and so on. Anthropological data collection, analysis, and writing can choose to bracket or ignore the embodied sensual nature of human experience and environments, or they can choose to engage with these as necessary and even entangled orders of evidence for any anthropological research problem. And I think that kind of sentiment kind of transcends just the kind of like anthropological sense of why this kind of multisensorial work is important. So in terms of the connotations of the term collision, which we've kind of spoke about, I thought it was kind of interesting that there are these various definitions of collision. So we have the general definition, which is the kind of violence that we're kind of used to thinking about. But there's also the computing definition that speaks about two things kind of occupying that space in the same memory, and the physics definition, which speaks more about the exchange of momentum and energy, which I thought was kind of like important for speaking about the project. So in terms of the collision of history and memory, as Campbell says here, archives typically operate as assertions of authority, producing and enforcing encoded pasts, and exist by nature as incomplete utterance, where its success requires the absence of memory. And so in this way, the remix operates as both, operates as a hypertext to the hypertext of what the original kind of archive was. And in terms of that particular assertion from Campbell at the top, the installation combats that assertion, and instead the remix operates, as I said, as a hypertext, connected through this kind of reimagination process. And in this way, the digital tools that we've employed have allowed us to kind of like conquer the ephemeral kind of nature of what the archive might be. So as Stoller then says, this kind of work allows us to kind of repossess ephemera from the archival practice and reimagine and reposition archives as operate in a very different way. So it's kind of important for me that the installation provided a kind of tension between the imagined stability of what the archive is and to instead invoke kind of like memory and history at the same time. So that the remix introduces constant recreation of history and constant repositioning of memory. So to give you an example of a couple of the letters from the listeners that we got. So this is one from DC. Here she's saying, Dear David Yumbo, will girls and women be able to pursue an education without fear? That was just her question. And then we had another question from a Korean viewer listener, which we'd have to translate later and have that be read in. So, I mean, that kind of prompts the question of how engagement with the project might be shaped by pre-existing experiences of listening to the radio, of asking for advice, of addressing kind of like public figures in this way. And the project, of course, does not exist in a vacuum, but is placed by visitors, each one using their own radiosonic-wise imaginaries. They may model their letter writing in some cases after the types of discourse styles seen in the transcript, but there are also maybe idiosyncratic and universal genres that they draw upon. So in terms of the collision of the reception and interaction, which I thought was a very kind of key part of the installation, the installation is arranged in physical space with the intention of providing the viewer-listener the opportunity to engage beyond a single visual observation. So as you kind of saw from the photographs, the physical space is created to actually facilitate memory, and the installation like heavily draws upon nostalgia. And while the remix troubles the idea of authenticity by explicitly ripping apart and repositioning and replacing and reconstituting archival material, it also aims to reinforce authenticity and relevance by allowing the visitor to participate in its creation as a created product and its continued creation as time goes on, which you can kind of see with the letters there. And in that way, it kind of fosters agency and a kind of shared ownership of the installation. And so I thought was kind of interesting when Kathy Lane gave her speech, her statement that sound art often privileges the purity of uninterrupted listening. I think the installation takes up Lane's challenge to kind of trouble this privilege because it is explicitly impure and actually requests interruption. So I think it's looking to kind of like tear down that privilege a little bit. So in terms of the collision between tactile and the sonic, which is probably the most obvious of the collisions that's present in the installation, there is the kind of analog as being tactile and digital as being sonic, and then reproducing the tactile in analog form. So it's kind of mimicking the actual looping of the cassette tape by actually looping the kind of like creativity of it, creation of it. And so yeah, as the instructions kind of say in the installation, press play, listen, flip through the transcript, write a letter. What eventually is kind of left off of this is press play again, because after you write the letter, it then gets back into the archive for you to press play again and go through this whole process. So there is a kind of like circularity to the whole thing that we kind of played with all the way through. So the installation ultimately asks of the viewer these kind of questions, which you can kind of look at, and which I'm not 100% sure necessarily that I have answers to, but it's kind of prompts for people actually interacting with the installation. And as the conference is entitled Sound Art Matters, I think the remix literally is about the collision of sound and physical matter. It's about how the physical installation space, the physical archive, and the kind of sound aspect of it are hitting up against each other in a sense that is not necessarily violent, but a way that it's sharing energy, feeding off of each other. So just to end, as Edinger states, one of the great challenges for contemporary ethnographers and artists is to reawaken our tactile sense of the past, to create multisensorial spaces in which the stories of the past are told and retold, understood and comprehended anew through prisms of sound, scent, movement, and touch. And I think this kind of speaks to everything that we were trying to do in the archive. And hopefully it was successful. Yeah, no problem. Thanks.
Well, thank you. That's really interesting. I guess, I mean, the first thing that comes to my mind is the issue of property rights, intellectual property rights, and it would be interesting to hear how you thought about that in this process. I know from my own experience with the National Broadcast Archive, it can be really hard to do anything similar to that. But I'm sure you have given it some thoughts, and relating to that, of course, there's a question of authorship. I mean, who is the author of these responses that come back from the archive? Your thoughts on that would be really interesting.
Yeah, in terms of the property rights, over the archive material itself, that was sorted out beforehand, and we've had continual conversations with the Zambia broadcasting system about what we can do, what we can't do. So on that side, it's fine. Right. In terms of new information coming in, there's maybe a unofficial agreement with people who have interacted with the installation about what intends to happen with it. And then I'm sure as it continues to kind of grow and move, we'll be in contact with those people just to kind of like follow up about it. But from the creative side of it, which is probably bad practice, I do the creation part and then have the other people worry about the legal part. And then, and then as it then relates to authorship, it's definitely something that we consider to be a shared authorship. So it's about opening up the kind of idea and sense of what the archive is to being more than just kind of like this fixed entity that is related to kind of a historical past. It's about continuing that history into a kind of a present space. And I think in doing that in and of itself is sharing the authorship of it. It's opening up the idea of authorship to be something more than just what that fixed archive might have looked like. And so, as you might have seen with the, head back to the transcript, all of the transcript, every page has this kind of tons and tons of information about where every different aspect of it is coming from, where every line is borrowed from, which tape, who said what, where they're coming from. So in that sense, all of that information is there and is made very much apparent. So yeah, it's very important for us to be open and honest about all aspects of it, really.
But if I just brief
sure.
follow-up, I mean, when you were remixing, what were your thoughts on, I mean, potentially you could, you know, mix it up into very small bits and then make him say some
wild and
crazy
crazy
things.
Yeah.
I mean, what were your, how was your...
My only thought was for it to seem as real to what the original tone of the radio program was. So I wanted to create, I mean, it's a reimagining of the program, but it is, I wanted, if it was listened to in 1989, for it to sound like, oh yeah, this is of the time, except that the questions would maybe make a little less sense because they might have modern themes in those questions. But yeah, my thought was to take as much of the funky stuff out of it and keep it as very true and honest to what he would have said. And that, how I came to that conclusion about what he would have said is listening to hours and hours of him kind of talking about stuff. Yeah.
Thank you for the presentation. I found it really intriguing, and I really like the idea of I guess asking the archive how it wants to be interpreted, and how the inheritors of the archive are to sort of engage with it. And to me, and I guess I'm a little sort of, to me it sort of resonates a bit with Derrida's notion of the archive, about evoking this ghost, and having a conversation with it, I guess, talking to it. And then I kind of also the notion of a radical transformation of the archive, which I would, well, that's at least the impression I get. And it's also I guess a radical transformation of the material. So even though you are sort of being true to the spirit of the original answers, it's still the cutting up and recompiling, I guess, would still equal that. So I guess it's more of a comment perhaps than a question.
Yeah, I mean, I'll take your last comment first. I think I was definitely very aware that as open and transparent as I would want my work to always be, that I'm hiding all of the work that goes into creating the archive back into this original format that makes it seem that much work hasn't really necessarily been done to it. So in a way, as you were kind of saying, that there is a radical transformation that has happened that is maybe hidden in the format in which the installation is presented, because it just kind of sounds like you listen to a radio program. And I was, very much aware of that. At one point, I was aware of that for egotistical reasons, because I knew how much work I put into it, and then people might say, well, you didn't do anything, you just recorded something and pressed play. But then also there are kind of like larger implications for what that might mean, and I think that's kind of the importance of the transcript, is that it really does kind of give you the kind of background information about what went into it. And in terms of kind of like invoking the ghost of the archive, I mean, Jumber's pictures like directly on the table. I mean, he, for all intents and purposes, is a ghost, and he's kind of hovering there. Well, he's not hovering, he's on the table, chilling. But he's there on the table kind of looking at you, you're listening to him speak, and it is a very kind of, not strange experience, but it's a very kind of unique experience to kind of be listening to a voice that has long been gone, answering questions that you might have had yesterday. And I think that is kind of speaks to the ways in which we do kind of like work and operate inside of archives, and how things from those archives continue to resonate in the work that we do kind of going forward. So, yeah, I mean, literally invokes a ghost is probably how I would describe it, yeah.
How much original material did you work from? I hope it wasn't clear what of your selection.
It was, I think I worked from 8, it might have been 8 or 10 original shows, because that's what had been transcribed at the time. So as more of it becomes digitized and more as it becomes transcribed, then I'll have more material to work from. But it was, maybe about 10 shows, I think, is what I kind of...
And that yielded you
two sides of a cassette answering 8 questions.
90 minutes?
No, well, it was a 60-minute cassette. We just recorded about 48 total. Yeah.